Okay, a gift in under an hour. That's doable. I'm thinking a cutting board or a serving board. So I found a really cool piece of wenge in my shop. I really love that color. So I cut off a couple pieces of that using my jigsaw, and then went over to the joiner and I flattened one side and I trued up one edge. I also found a piece of maple, and that had me thinking, it would look really cool if I had a wenge cutting board and then had a maple contrasting stripe in it. So I went ahead and milled that up too. I ran all my boards to the planer, trying to keep them really as thick as possible. When it comes to serving boards and cutting boards, I think that they look better whenever they're on the thicker side. So it's probably like 1.25 inches thick, I'm thinking. I don't know, I didn't really measure it. I cut my boards to rough width over at the table saw and then tried to figure out how do I want this to look. And what I'm thinking would look cool is having a wide section of wenge, then having the maple stripe, and then having a narrow section. So that stripe is kind of slightly off-centered. So I put my pieces together and then placed a mark, try to figure out just what looks good. I ended up coming up with something that looks like 9 inches wide, about 18 inches long. Since this is a cutting board, it's probably going to get wet at some point. So I glued it together using Titebond 3 because Titebond 3 is waterproof. Now I really could not let this dry fully, so I only let it dry for about 15 minutes. And then I ran it through the planer just enough to try to get rid of any of the glue squeeze out. I cleaned up both ends over the table saw using a miter gauge. And again, I cut this down to probably about 18 inches long or so. I didn't really measure it too closely. I was thinking that just because it's quick doesn't mean it can't look fancy, so I turned my blade to 45 degrees and then cut bevels on the underside of the cutting board. Now I like to start with the end grain, because if I cut the end grain and there's a little bit of hair out on the back side, it's not a big deal. It's going to get cleaned up whenever I cut the bevels for the long sides. If you've never worked with wenge, know that it's a beautiful wood, but it's also splintery as crap. And you don't want to give a gift where somebody's going to get splinters. So I went over to the router table and I put in a 1/8 inch round over bit and I rounded over all the edges on the top side of the board. I didn't worry about the bottom side because I already cut the bevels and it's going to get sanded, so that's going to kind of naturally take care of itself. I sanded my cutting board with 120 grit, then 180 grit, and then 220 grit. And I also made sure that I sanded the bevels and then the ends too. Since this is the cutting board, and like I said, it's probably going to get wet at some point, it's a good idea to go ahead and pop the grain. So you just take some water, spray down the surface, wipe it down, and it's just enough to get the grain to raise up from the water. Then resand it real quick with 220 grit. That thing's going to be baby butt smooth. The last step is finish, and we want to keep this simple, right? So I went with a butcher block oil. So this is just a combination of mineral oil and some wax. Super easy to apply, let it sit for a second, wipe off any excess, and then it's really easy to refresh later on if the board starts looking a little bit dull. There you have it. Super quick, easy project. You can knock out in less than an hour, probably even faster if you had a faster setting glue than what I had. Take out the drying time, this whole project took me under 30 minutes.